Today's sponsor is Coastal Crypto. Coastal Crypto can be found at coastalcryptomining.com via the affiliate link down in the description below. They don't want to take up a lot of your time, and neither do I, because I want to get into the video. They are here to help miners find parts. If you're looking for ASICs or even GPUs or any other parts, be sure to check them out. Use promo code SOAT at checkout for 5% off any purchase on the website. Can Ethereum out-engineer the censors by shuttering the beacon chain? Ethereum developers are realizing censorship is not a problem that can be just coded away. In the previous edition of ValidPoint's newsletter, we drove headfirst into the debate around censorship on Ethereum. We've been talking about this a lot on the channel as well. We focused on the role that validators, the computers that propose blocks of transactions on Ethereum's upcoming proof-of-stake network, might play in censoring transactions. The censorship debate sprang up in response to the recent U.S. sanctions against Tornado Cash, the Ethereum mixer program used by money launderers and everyday Ethereum users to send and receive money without leaving a clear trail. In light of the concerns that Ethereum's transactions might be censored, members of the Ethereum community have been discussing ways the core protocol can be engineered to make censorship difficult or even impossible. One of the more compelling ideas for how this might work is a shutterized beacon chain, a proposal that encrypts key transaction details so they cannot be censored by validators. But Martin Kopelman, the creator of this idea, isn't so sure that censorship is a problem that the Ethereum community can code its way out of. For a community used to engineering its way out of and into problems, this may be a hard pill to swallow. The fear 2 weeks ago was that major validators such as Coinbase and Kraken might censor transactions in accordance with the U.S. Treasury Department sanctions. This potential for censorship was all the more worrisome given the few validators' control of majority of the stake on Ethereum's soon-to-arrive proof-of-stake network. And it gets even crazier too when we start talking about the distribution of the nodes across cloud infrastructure, where, like we talked about yesterday, essentially we have the potential for way over 50% of the nodes being run on AWS, and thereby pretty much giving AWS the ability to censor Ethereum transactions just based on them controlling the infrastructure. And there is no way to compete with cloud infrastructure the size of AWS at this time. And so if you really want to remain decentralized and remove censorship as a whole, I think that you have to be proof of work. I don't think that there's any really way around that at the end of the day. And preferably even proof of work without ASICs too, right? On the positive side, for those opposed to censorship, Coinbase and other big name validators have clarified their position on how they will handle sanctioned transactions. Most, but not all responsive have echoed that of Coinbase CEO Brian Armstrong, who said he would sooner end his company's staking business than succumb to censorship. And here's the thing is I don't necessarily believe him. Right? Like we've seen what Coinbase has done in the past as far as, setting up organizations to provide tracking services to the federal government. So I think that they're full of shit. I think that he is lying, and he's just saying that because that's the best PR move right now. But when the rubber meets the road and the federal government is asking them to sanction, I for sure think Brian Armstrong will flip on you and decide to participate in sanctioning and censorship. Hands down, believe it 100%. I do not think that what he is saying here is more than anything but a PR move at this current time. And that is proven from his track record in the past and what they have been doing. So don't believe him. But on the negative side, a whole new set of questions has cropped up around whether transactions can be blocked before they are even sent by validators. These challenges center around MEV-boost, a piece of middleware that most validators are expected to use come the merge. Now, we've talked about MEV-boost in the past. One of the things I've said too in the past way back is that MEV is a much larger problem than even moving to proof of stake, right? And MEV is only... the MEV boost is problems are only exacerbated by the move to proof of stake, right? Which used to be here's the thing that's funny is it used to be called maximal extracted value, which now it's going to be called again. But then when it was getting negative connotations surrounding it, they changed it to miner extracted value, which, to be fair, it kind of was, because the miners were ordering the transactions. This is how this works. MEV-boost means that the miners have some sort of control over ordering transactions and can get additional payouts due to that. But now it's going back to being rebranded as maximal extracted value, because miners will no longer be on the network. But before we continue, we will need to explain one of the critical challenges plaguing Ethereum and other blockchain networks, MEV. When an Ethereum user issues a transaction, it's not automatically accepted by the rest of the network. First, it goes into the so-called mempool, a giant bucket of unconfirmed transactions from Ethereum users. Recall that a block is just a glorified list of transactions. Validators scan, select, and organize mempool transactions into blocks, and they propose out of the wider network. If they're clever, they'll do this in a way that extracts a bit of extra profit for themselves, a concept called maximal or miner extractable value, or MEV. Validators aren't the only actors squeezing out MEV. So-called searchers have also emerged, computers that scan the mempool and preview what transactions are upcoming. They then bribe validators by issuing transactions with a higher fee or tip to include their own transactions ahead of others that they expect to impact the market. MEV practices range from benign to malicious. On the more malicious end, searchers and validators can use their future-telling abilities to screw over the other market participants. Take sandwich attacks, for example, and we've talked about this in detail last year, by the way. I think there's a whole video I have dedicated on it if you want more detail. But say a searcher sees in the mempool that Bob is about to buy a bunch of DAI on a particular exchange. The searcher knows that Bob's transaction will increase the price of DAI, so the searcher buys up a bunch of DAI for itself right before Bob does. Then, after Bob pumps the price of DAI, the searcher dumps the DAI tokens that is just bought while the price was lower. The searcher, if they are clever, will net out with a profit. Bob, on the other hand, will probably pay a bit extra for the DAI as a result of the searcher's initial purchase. No fun. MEV-boost makes a bet that MEV, if it can be exterminated, can at least be more equitable if it can't be exterminated. Flashbots, its creator, achieves this by separating the actors who build blocks from the validators who propose them out to the wider Ethereum network. Builders, not validators, do the complicated optimization work of selecting and ordering transactions into blocks in a way that maximizes MEV. If everyone uses MEV-boost, the thinking goes, then at least everyone will have a fair shot at extracting MEV. Proposer-builder separation will eventually be baked into Ethereum's core code, but MEV-boost is a stopgap solution. To make things work, it relies on centralized relays to send blocks from builders to proposers. And this is where the whole issue of censorship comes into play. And we've talked about this before, but hopefully this is actually laying it out pretty good. Flashbots say that its own relay, the default relay that will be shipped with MEV-boost, will censor transactions in accordance with Tornado Cash sanctions. So what you essentially have is the position in that MEV-boost, which is the most widely used, is going to participate in sanctions with Tornado Cash. Yes, this isn't Ethereum itself, but it is a major player within Ethereum and pretty much how Ethereum functions, and is integrated into a ton of different applications on Ethereum, meaning that just one developer's actions here with Flashbots affects the entire network. It's pretty rough. Unsurprisingly, the wider Ethereum community was not happy to hear this. In response to community backlash, the team opted to make open source its relay software earlier than originally planned. This means other parties will be able to set up non-censoring relays when MEV-boost launches. Validators will have the option of selecting whether they want to use the censored or uncensored relay option. Even though uncensored relays will be optional, that's all they'll be, optional. For anti-censorship hardliners, which includes many Ethereum core developers, this is not enough. With all this controversy around censoring validators, relays, and software providers emerges a key question. What if censorship could be engineered out of existence. In a world where trustlessness is a core tenet, such as a utopian ideal becomes appealing. Enter Shutterized beacon chain. In a research proposal this past March, authors framed the Shutterized beacon chain concept as a way to solve the MEV problem. The proposal introduced a new Ethereum transactions that are encrypted when they go to the mempool. Outside of limited information like the tip that a transaction includes for validators to ensure it gets added to a block, other core details like who is sending the transaction, who is on the receiving end, and the quantity of tokens changing hands are hidden from searchers and block builders. Only after a transaction is approved and confirmed on chain will its content become unencrypted. The idea was originally proposed by Martin Kopelman, the founder of Gnosis Chain. The concept of a shutterized beacon chain in general is that we separate transaction inclusion from transaction execution, he explained to CoinDesk. So you have a period where you blindly include transactions purely based on whether they are paying a fee and whether they are paying a high enough fee. If they do, they should be included, and that's it. It's obvious why this might be useful from an anti-MEV perspective. If block builders and searchers can't see transactions payloads, meaning what is being paid to whom, then they won't have the information they need to extract MEV. How can you front run a transaction if you don't know what it contains? And that's awesome, in my humble opinion. As a side effect, shutterization would or could play a major role in preventing censorship. Validators and relays won't know whether to censor a transaction if they can't see its sender or recipient. Perfect. We won't dive too deeply into the underlying mechanics of the shutterized beacon chain concept in this newsletter. Beyond being complicated, the idea hasn't yet been fully fleshed out and out on an engineering level. So not so fast. Kopelman says the shutterized beacon chain concept didn't gain much attention when it was introduced in March. Partly he thinks it was because MEV extractors, which account for a large portion of the Ethereum community, have profited handsomely from Ethereum's unencrypted status quo. And that is kind of what I was wondering at this point, because you're going to have those, essentially your validators and the people that are highly invested in Ethereum do profit pretty heavily off of MEV. And if your governance is going to be surrounded by people that profit off of a certain thing, getting rid of that certain thing is probably not going to be extremely popular. And the thing is they would rather have centralization and censorship and make more money than they would want to have a censorless and fair network, right? And removing MEV will remove a huge portion of the profits of a lot of people that are going to end up validating the network here coming up soon. When Kopelman repitched the idea around censorship after August's Tornado Cash sanctions, though it was received warmly by members of the Ethereum developer community, some even took the idea further, suggesting that all transactions be shutterized, rather than making it optional as suggested in the original proposal. But questions remain. What if governments decide that processing transactions containing sanctioned addresses is illegal, regardless of whether the transactions were encrypted when they were picked up by validators? Or what if regulators decide to treat shutterization like Tornado Cash, outlawing a shutterized beacon chain entirely? Despite the recent enthusiasm around this idea, Kopelman noted in his conversation with CoinDesk that it is not as if shutterization or any engineering intervention can ultimately solve Ethereum's censorship problem. I think it's almost always possible, whatever the regulatory challenge is, to find an engineering solution. However, I also think that if you always try to find an engineering solution to it, at the end, Ethereum and crypto will become extremely niche, Kopelman told CoinDesk. And, I think that that's an interesting concept, which is to adhere to the principles of crypto, or as closely to the principles of crypto as possible. You have to consider the fact that it won't be widely adopted. So we've always talked about this kind of concept between like adoption and principles. And I think it's one of the most difficult conversations to actually have within cryptocurrency. I mean, this starts with something as simple as a centralized exchange versus holding your own keys, and the barrier to entry that sets for retail and the adoption rate. And that goes over and applies to stuff like this. If, you know, Ethereum or any other cryptocurrency is outside of regulatory, you know, outside of the regulatory arm of different governments, you end up in a position where it won't be as widely adopted, because at the end of the day, frankly, people don't have any balls and they're scared to death of their own governments. And that's where we sit, right? Because if that wasn't the case, a lot less people would be paying taxes at this point. So don't tell me that people aren't scared of the government, because that is exactly what is going on. And if you have basically the government coming down and putting regulations on and surrounding crypto, people will just be too scared to participate in it, and you'll reduce adoption. And if cryptocurrency projects are going to try to adhere to the principles of cryptocurrency and basically push back on censorship, etc., from regulatory bodies, they will end up putting themselves into, of course, that cyberpunk niche. And that is where it will live for the time being. There has to be some sort of weird balance between, of course, the principles of crypto and adoption, and getting past that hump is going to be extremely difficult. When we talk about, you know, things like Jerome Powell saying things are going to get really difficult right here really soon, I don't think that just applies to the economy and to inflation and to rising energy costs. I think that also basically applies to the relationship between nation states and governments and their people. And I think that it's obviously with things like, you know, the president of the United States coming out against an entire group of people based on their political affiliation and basically challenging them to attack, and he'll use F-15s against them like he did yesterday and last night. It is very clear that the nation states and the governments see their people as an enemy, not as somebody to protect and take care of and provide for, which means that we have everything backwards now, and we are in a position where things are going to be more difficult. Thanks for checking out this clip from the Crypto Mining Show. You can check out the full episode here or more crypto content down here. Also, I'd like you to check out my locals page at sonofatech.locals.com, where you can become a member for free or choose to be a $5 a month supporter that unlocks additional content.